Welcome to the Wheel of Time Diaries. I'm your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC, and today we're going to be covering, in a spoiler-free context, mind you, right off the bat, the 5 books of the Wheel of Time that I'm considering to be the quote-unquote slog just for ease of discernment, even though the arguments about whether the slog exists and which books could be considered that, if it does exist, are all various different types of arguments that we could have. That is, we'll discuss a little bit of that later, but the point is that we're discussing another arc of the Wheel of Time, where you have the first 3 books that basically make a trilogy. You have the next 3 books, which again basically make a trilogy. You then have the next 5 books, which basically make the arc of the series following Lord of Chaos up until the point where you're coming up on the last trilogy, the Brando Sando trilogy up there. And I think that for all intents and purposes, and for the purposes of today's discussion, that works. And like I said, I'm just calling it the slog just out of ease. Whether or not you actually believe the slog exists, we'll talk about that later. What I want to do in today's videos, we'll go over a brief overview of like my ratings and how long I've spent reading the series, some of that kind of stuff here in the introduction. Then we'll do very brief overviews of my thoughts on the 5 individual books. Very brief overviews. If you want full spoiler-free reviews, then I have spoiler-free reviews for all 5 of these books on the channel already. And if you want anything spoiler-related, I have multiple episodes of spoiler talks in the Wheel of Time Diaries series for all of these books. Again, all already on the channel, so we'll just do very brief overviews in today's video, and then we'll do an overview of this arc of the series, a little bit more broad scale after that, and then we'll conclude with some of the plans that I've got going on in the new year with regard to finishing the series, if that isn't tease enough for you guys. So we'll go ahead and start off with, honestly, just a little bit of information for you guys about how much time I have personally spent reading this series so far. It is a lot of time. I'm a slow reader, and these books are pretty big, so it has been a lot. For reference, let's talk about the previous arcs of the series. The first trilogy, or books 1 through 3, I spent about 86 hours reading, more or less exactly. The next trilogy, books 4 through 6, over here, plus New Spring, because I read New Spring after Fires of Heaven. Those 4 books I spent a combined total of about 137 hours reading, again, more or less exactly. My total for these 5 books is 147 and a quarter hours or so, bringing my grand total to just over 370 hours. 370 hours and 17 minutes if we're going to be basically exact. Yes, I've continued to time about how long I actually spend reading this series. So for 11 books plus New Spring, all of Robert Jordan's output within the Wheel of Time, I've spent over 370 hours of my life over the last 2.5 years reading the Wheel of Time. That is a lot of time. So let's discuss how I feel about these books. And again, we're going to do a little bit of reference framing for the earlier books in the series. My average rating for the first 6 books plus New Spring comes out to about a 4.6 out of 5. So that's actually pretty high. I quite enjoyed all of those first 6 books. People clowned on me a little bit for liking, The Shadow Rising and Lord of Chaos the least of those 7 entries. That's not a popular take, I understand, but you have to understand that 4.6 out of 5 average rating for those first 7 books, pretty high up there. In comparison, my ratings for the slog here is not as great. A Crown of Swords, I rated 4 stars. The Path of Daggers, I rated 3.5, which I rounded down for the purposes of Goodreads. Winter's Heart, I rated 2.5 out of 5, which I rounded up, again, for the purposes of Goodreads. So on Goodreads, both Path of Daggers and Winter's Heart are labeled as 3 stars, even though they're a little bit further apart in my brain. Crossroads of Twilight, I rated just straight up 3 out of 5, and then Knife of Dreams, I rated 4 out of 5, kind of like a Crown of Swords. So you have a pretty good bookend there, but that means that these 5 books together average to 3.4 out of 5, which you'll notice is quite a bit lower than 4.6 out of 5 average for all of the previous entries combined. That puts my average for the Wheel of Time in general at 4.1 out of 5, but 4.1 out of 5 is still a pretty good average for the series at this point after 12 books. Like, that's actually a pretty solid average. You just, have some of those that are a little bit lower on the spectrum, and then a handful that are a little bit higher on the spectrum, and those tending to be kind of grouped up together for the most part. But let's talk about the individual entries, what I felt about these 5 books as a very brief, broad overview. A Crown of Swords, which again I rated 4 out of 5. I think it's a little bit of undue hate as a general rule. I think some people kind of lump it in with the Slog, the way that I'm doing here, ironically enough, in ways that don't entirely make sense to me. I actually think that A Crown of Swords is a little bit quicker and easier to read than is Lord of Chaos for the most part, because Lord of Chaos is quite long, has some pacing issues, and also does some weird things with one of the plot lines and the timing of switching things to a new goal that made it kind of just feel weird to read at some times, whereas A Crown of Swords, you kind of understand what it's doing the entire time. It's mostly a reaction to the end of Lord of Chaos, which is solid. Otherwise, it just kind of continues that plot line that starts at the end of Lord of Chaos. Otherwise, the quality of A Crown of Swords is pretty consistent overall, despite the climax being admittedly pretty rushed, but that's something that I've had experience with from Robert Jordan. In general, things, I would say, like, the climaxes of the first couple books could be argued to be a little bit rushed. The climax of The Shadow Rising, I think, is definitely pretty rushed. A Crown of Swords is probably the most rushed climax of the series up to this point, if I'm being completely honest, so that one, detracts its score a little bit. Realistically, I could have seen myself giving this a 4.5 out of 5, and maybe I still could. I don't know, but, it does have that rushed climax, like I said. Overall, I really liked A Crown of Swords. It's probably my favorite of all of the entries of the series that I have rated 4 out of 5 so far. So that being The Shadow Rising, Lord of Chaos, Crown of Swords, and then even Knife of Dreams. I think A Crown of Swords is probably my favorite of those 4 entries for reference. Maybe Knife of Dreams would overtake it. I'm not entirely sure. I haven't made an official ranking of the series at this point that I'm 100% confident about right now. But that's like my broad overview of A Crown of Swords. Path of Daggers is a little bit of a stranger entry in my mind, and that is because up to that point in the series, I definitely felt like it was the weakest entry of the series. It was definitely the worst one, kind of on an objective level. But I just had so much fun reading it. I enjoyed reading it so much that it didn't really bother me that much. That's kind of why I gave it the 3.5, and I rounded that down because it was a little bit too weak, particularly in the last act, to justify rounding that up to 4. But I had a ton of fun with it, to the degree that, at least for a little while, I'm not 100% sure at this point, I had it ranked like tied with, if not above, A Crown of Swords, just because I enjoyed reading it so much, just because I think about reading that book so much more fondly than I think about reading many of the other entries of the series. So most of the book I read very quickly, and I enjoyed a lot, despite the climax being pretty off, despite that final act not feeling super climactic and just being kind of weird. Despite one of the better plot lines of the series being completely absent from the book, there are a lot of things that I really enjoyed about it. But on the other end of the spectrum, I can also acknowledge that Path of Daggers is definitely where some of Robert Jordan's prose bloat issues really start to become a bit more apparent. There was some of that going on in The Shadow Rising, a little bit going on in Lord of Chaos, but nothing that was like really detrimental to my experience overall. But Path of Daggers through the rest of Robert Jordan's output is when this starts to become a little bit more consistently an issue. That was something that I definitely noticed. I can acknowledge the weaknesses of Path of Daggers, but I just found it to be so fun that it's like in Crown of Swords territory for me, despite it being, weaker and worse in all regards. With regard to Winter's Heart, this is one of my 2 hot takes of the series, or maybe 3 of this. Well, I have a lot of hot takes with the series, actually, a lot of relatively unpopular opinions. But as far as this arc of the series goes, probably my least popular opinion is going to be that Winter's Heart is, for me, it is my personal least favorite book of the Slog, and that is because it has become very apparent by this point in the series, by book 9 here, that Robert Jordan just does too little planning with the series, that he wasn't outlining. He had no idea what he was doing with some of the plot lines. If I'm not mistaken, Egwene's plot line does not exist in this book at all. I think, and Perrin's plotline may as well not exist. It takes up 6 entire chapters, but it would have been better if it didn't take up any time at all because those 6 chapters were bad. The front half of the book in general is very cumbersome, very weak, not great at all, just kind of hard to push through, and I think that the back half, on top of all those issues, is pretty overrated. I don't think that either the climax is full enough or complete enough, so I found myself dissatisfied or underwhelmed by them. Like, Rand's climax just did not explore any of the things about that entire sequence that I personally wanted to see on the page. So that was a, discrepancy between what I wanted and what Robert Jordan was doing. Like, what it was doing was fine. It's just not what I wanted. So I found myself very underwhelmed by it, even though it is a massive moment for the series. And then Matt's plotline has a climax in Winter's Heart that is like incomplete. It has a climactic moment that it ends on, but the entire sequence is like stopped halfway through, and that just really bothers me. So between all of the weaknesses of the book and the stronger parts not being strong enough, Winter's Heart just really didn't do it for me. It's not an awful book by any means, but it is, in my opinion, the weakest book of the series, actually, even including Crossroads of Twilight, which, moving into discussion on Crossroads of Twilight, yeah, it is objectively the most bloated of the series by far, and unjustifiably so. There's no reason why Crossroads of Twilight needed to be longer than, say, Path of Daggers, but it also could have been a solid, 30,000 words shorter even than that, which means it could have been 100,000 words shorter than it is, and you would not have lost any of the actual content of the book. That is how much of the prose bloat comes through in Crossroads of Twilight. That is easy to acknowledge right up front. I'm not going to deny that it's there, because it is there, and it is also very inefficient in plotting with all of the storylines. It just takes too long to do too little of a thing. But it also, the construction of it, kind of worked for me on a foundational sense. The fact that it centralizes the timeline or normalizes the timeline, gets all of the plot lines in basically the same period of time. It's just okay, I now know when all of this stuff is happening, because that's something that started to get away from Robert Jordan over the course of these handful of books here. He finally brings all those together, utilizing the very end of Winter's Heart as, again, a mechanism of reacting to that from all of the plot lines, and does so pretty well. And in that sense, Crossroads of Twilight is basically like a bridge book in between the end of Winter's Heart and then prepping for what Knife of Dreams ultimately ends up doing, especially in its second half, which is wrapping up all of these plot lines, which have been going on for the last 4 or 5 books, depending on the plot line. So in a lot of ways, Crossroads of Twilight is just kind of there. It just exists. It's like a bridge book in between these other books, and understanding it as that bridge book, I actually found a lot to appreciate about it as a result. Like I said, reacting to Winter's Heart and preparing for Knife of Dreams, I think the book is over maligned if you look at it from that context of what it is actually doing, even though it is very bloated, and even though it still has its weaknesses with regard to that. If you're expecting Crossroads of Twilight to be, even moderately like any of the other books are or should be as far as they're structured, yeah, you're going to be very disappointed with it. And so I understand why people dislike Crossroads of Twilight so much, but that's why I make such a point of saying, this is like a bridge book in between the two books. Don't expect much to happen. Expect it to just be a reaction and then a preparation, and that's what it's doing, and it's fine. It's a fine execution of doing that, but again, still very bloated. Knife of Dreams is the other unpopular opinion that I sort of have, and that is that it is a return to form for Robert Jordan and for the series, but only because Robert Jordan actually decides to close out all the plot lines that he has started working on with these books, particularly books 8 through 11. Have a lot of things going on in all of the plot lines that's just okay, we're doing this thing now, and then it takes just too long to do those things. It takes multiple books to do things that should not take multiple books to do, and so Knife of Dreams is a little bit overrated in the sense that people were this is one of the better books of the series, and I don't think that's true. I think it just has a little bit of that reputation because the back half in particular is that much better than what the last few books have offered, and the fact that it actually has some of these climaxes and resolutions and actually closes off several of these plot lines that have been needing to be closed off for multiple books at this point, it gets a very good rap because of that, and it's deserved. That material is good in it, but there's also a lot of weaknesses to it as well. I think that most of the first half of the book, outside of the prologue, and like the other Egwene White Tower related stuff in the first couple chapters. Most of the rest of the first half of Knife of Dreams is just as bloated as Crossroads of Twilight is, for example. So like it does some things right in closing off some plot lines and wrapping some things up, getting the series in a place that's ready for the Brandon Sanderson trilogy to commence after all. But there's also, it shares plenty of the weaknesses with some of the other books as well. So it's like, you know, a kind of give and take. You know, I like it. It's 4 out of 5. But depending on how you look at things, it's got some good to it. It's also got some weaknesses to it as well. But so now let's move on to talking about this arc of the series, talking about the Slog in general, what the entire 5-book sequence does and doesn't do right. I think the main thing to note about these 5 books is that it just takes a little bit too long to accomplish a little bit too little as a general rule. I think these 5 books, if there was some outlining, if there was some proper planning going on ahead of time, you could have had a 3-book trilogy-like arc in these books if you tried hard enough. Like I said, if there was enough planning going on, that would not have been an impossible feat to accomplish. But because Robert Jordan just didn't do that, you end up with a lot of plot lines that are very clearly bloated. You end up with plot lines that are like completely missing from some of the books because Jordan just has no idea what he's going to do with them. You also have characters that have just too much screen time or too little screen time, depending on who it is. I think that Rand's plot has broadly a lot less screen time than you might expect for being the main character of the series throughout these books, because there's so much that other storylines need to do, but also Robert Jordan doesn't make those storylines do very much with the runtime he gives them. I think that like Matt's plotline and especially Elaine's plotline just take way too long to do what they're doing. Like they have honestly a relatively simple goal, and they just have too many words assigned to them. As a whole, Robert Jordan's prose does start to get quite bloated and unbearable at points within this arc of the series. I think that is undeniable. Perrin's plotline in particular just does not justify its runtime because nothing is happening, so there's a lot of bloat there because nothing's going on, but still he's writing about it. Elaine's plotline is fine. Like, I don't think that plotline's actually that bad, but it also does take far too many words. For example, she has she has anywhere from like 15 to 25% of each book from books 8 through 11. And like, you would not guess that she would have that many words based off of what actually gets accomplished in that time. It does not justify that amount of words. Like in Winter's Heart and Crossroads of Twilight in particular, she has the highest amount of word allotment from any POV in each of those 2 books, and basically nothing to show for it. Like, you do not look at either of those books and remember anything of real importance happening in Elaine's plotline. I mean, like, there's a couple of things, to be fair, but like nothing like super drastic, and nothing that would make sense for her to have that many words. You know, anything that happens is like, you know, a couple chapters worth, not, you know, a quarter of the book worth. So you have these problems, and this is broadly shared between some of the other plot lines as well, but Elaine's plotline is a very good example of like, why does this character have this many words when so little actually happens during this arc of the series? It's kind of a problem. And more than just the prose issue, I think that Robert Jordan just kind of forgets how to pace things very well within these books. I think that like even Matt's plotline begins to drag on a little bit because of some of the prose bloat and just forgetting how and when to do certain things and when to have certain things happen in effective timing matters. I think this is a lot of the problem with Knife of Dreams, as I covered in that review. A lot of the first half of that book is Matt and Elaine stuff that just didn't really need to take that long. In fact, it was stuff that could have been done in just an extra chapter of each plot line in the previous book leading up to this, so that you could cut out basically all of what happens in those plot lines in the first half of Knife of Dreams, and thus be able to cut Knife of Dreams a lot because of that prose bloat. So like, there are just a lot of pacing issues that are kind of related to the prose issues. So, you know, for the most part, I think the actual content of what is happening in these books is fine outside of like Perrin's plotline, because at that point there's so little happening at all that it's hard to justify in any way. But in general, I think most of the content of this arc of the series is fine. It's just that it didn't need 5 books to do all of this. It could have done all this in 3 books, and done it quite easily, again, if Robert Jordan just actually planned it out. There are plenty of exciting moments and sequences within this arc as well, but I think what defines the series is how little of those things are like broad scale important. Outside of the climax of Rand's plotline in book 9, there's basically nothing that happens in these 5 books that feels like it has major ramifications for the series at large. I mean, like, there definitely is. There's a lot of like Sean Chan stuff that happens in this arc of the series that is like obviously very important, broadly speaking, but it takes so long that it doesn't have as much impact as I feel like it's supposed to. So like that kind of goes to explain some of the issues with the pacing and whatnot that's going on here. There are moments that are definitely exciting and defining for the series, but a lot of them are underwhelming or take too long to happen, or by the time they actually go anywhere, you've already just kind of forgotten that that was even important in the first place because it just took so long. So there's a lot of these types of problems. Like, I know I'm kind of beating a dead horse at this point, but that's what happens in this arc of the series is not much, and what does happen takes too long to do it. So at the end of the day, does the slog of the Wheel of Time actually exist? I think that will depend entirely on the reader. For me, it's like, yes, it basically does, but I also think it's a little bit overblown, and that's because I understand both sides of the argument here. I understand all the people who don't feel like there's a slog, the people who didn't notice anything sloggy when they were reading the books. That's a personal taste thing. I get how people could read these books and not really notice, but I also understand how there are people who could read these books and just absolutely be dying. There are people who read the first like 3 or 4 books and think they're dreadfully slow and dismal, and it's just like, yeah, then definitely don't continue on because that's only going to get more noticeable. I say this as somebody who personally didn't feel like there was much pacing or size-related issues with most of the series up until this point. You know, there's a little bit of bloat maybe in The Shadow Rising if I wanted to be nitpicky about it, and then there was a bit of bloat and also pacing issues in Lord of Chaos as a result of a couple of structural decisions. But beyond those 2 books, and that being relatively minor complaint, even in both of those books, I was not somebody who would have felt like that this would have been a major issue for the series, but in these books it starts to become a little bit more of an issue. So I think it depends on who you are. Maybe the fact that I read so slow exacerbates this issue, whereas I know some people who read very quickly and did not notice the issue at all. Maybe reading speed goes into it, but overall, whether you feel the slog or not is probably going to come down to the individual reader. I also understand a couple different aspects of how people feel about this entire discussion. The fact that I'm talking about it right now. I understand those who find the discourse around the slog of Wheel of Time very cumbersome and annoying and kind of just tedious or whatever, but I also understand the people who find this section of the series to be pretty irredeemable and want to make it clear to people going into the series for the first time that, like, hey, there's a section of the series that might be difficult to push through, because that's a very valid thing to want to warn somebody about when this book is 14 books, or when the series is 14 books long, not counting the prequel. That's on this side of the bookshelf, not the other one. My apologies. The point is that I understand why people don't want to talk about it. If you didn't really feel it, you might think that it's very overblown, and to a degree, I agree. But I also understand the people who want to make it clear that, like, this is an issue with the series, and so come to overblow it, because, like, I'm also kind of doing the same thing. You know, I have both feelings of being too warm about the series and too cold about the series. There are haters who trash it altogether far too much, in my opinion, and there are also lovers of the series who don't do enough to address its actual criticisms. But again, we're going to come back to kind of like my ratings from the very beginning of the video here. My average rating for the series is 4.1 out of 5. That is a great average rating at this point after having read 12 books within the series. That is great. But you also have to look at those sections, kind of the way that I did earlier. The first 7 of those books I read, being the first 6 books plus New Spring, my average was 4.6 pre-Slog arc. That is a very high rating. That meant that like I was really having a great time with the series. But then the Slog arc, these 5 books have a 3.4 star average. That is a big decrease from 4.6 as far as rating averages go. That's actually quite massive. So even for somebody who really enjoys a lot of that early part of the series, I'm acknowledging that this arc of the series has some major issues, and denying that would be silly. So yeah, clearly I'm a big fan of these books, but there are issues. Like I said, I look at the broader whole of the series a little bit more negatively than the individual entries overall, I think, and I look at each entry more positively than some people credit me for doing. There are people who acted like I hate The Shadow Rising, for example, for it being my least favorite book in the series up until like books 9 and 10 basically, but that doesn't mean that I actually hate that book, because I don't, and it would be silly to think that I do so. So the issue is I'm trying to be realistic and true to my own experience with the series, and that kind of complicates things. I think that the Slog is overblown, but I also think that it is subject to taste, because I also think it exists at the same time. So that's how I feel. But to close out this video and this diary, I can definitely say one thing for sure, and that is the fact that I'm ready to be done with this series. I have the last 3 books kind of standing on the shelf back there, ready to get into them, and we'll be reading them more or less back to back pretty soon here in 2026. The time that this video comes out is the first day of the year, so Happy New Year's I should probably have started the video with. But very soon I'm going to be reading the rest of the series. The plan at the moment is to read Gathering Storm in February, Towers of Midnight in March, and A Memory of Light in April. So like I said, basically back-to-back, definitely back-to-back months, which is quicker than I've done any reading for the series up to this point. For the most part, I've taken 1 month at least in between books. Which has been very vital and necessary, but I'm going to try to read these last few books a little bit quicker, but I'm not going to like rush it. You know, if anything runs a little bit too quick or too long, I'll adjust accordingly if I need to, meaning that I could finish a little bit early if I feel like I'm able to, but I could also finish a little bit late if it's not going to work out, which it very well might not work out, you know. I'm definitely anticipating this needing to take at least through May to complete, not just being able to finish in April, but we'll see what happens. I'm looking forward to continuing and finishing the series, and looking forward to the little bit of a shake-up that Brandon Sanderson is definitely going to inject into the series, because yeah, it's going to be a little bit different, but yeah, I'm looking forward to finishing it, but I'm not sure how much of that is me excited to read the last 3 books, which there is excitement for that, don't get me wrong, but there's also a little bit of me that just wants to be done and have this all behind me, so we'll see how that goes over the next few months. For now, I've been your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC, and I hope to see you guys in the next video.